Robert John Bardo. On July 18, 1989, actress Rebecca Schaeffer opened her door to a stranger who had been following her for 3 years. Robert John Bardo, a 19-year-old from Tucson, Arizona, had become fixated on the My Sister Sam star after seeing her on television. Bardo had endured a troubled childhood marked by family difficulties, including placement in foster care at 15 after expressing thoughts of self-harm. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and later showed signs of deeper psychological issues that forensic psychiatrist Park Dietz would describe during trial proceedings. How did he find her address? Bardo hired a private investigator who used DMV records to obtain Schaeffer's West Hollywood address, a practice that was legal at the time but would later be restricted due to this case. The ease with which personal information could be obtained highlighted dangerous gaps in privacy protections for public figures. His obsession intensified after seeing Schaeffer in a film, scene he deemed immoral, triggering what prosecutors would describe as rage rooted in his perception that she had lost her innocence. This distorted thinking reflected the parasocial relationship he had constructed in his mind, where he felt entitled to judge her personal choices. On that July morning, Bardo traveled to her apartment building and rang her doorbell twice. When Schaeffer answered the second time, he shot her in the chest at close range with a .357 Magnum revolver. She collapsed in the doorway and died shortly after at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Bardo fled the scene and was arrested the next day in Tucson, wandering in traffic on Interstate 10. Police found him acting erratically, and he quickly confessed to the incident. The weapon and other evidence linked him definitively to the scene. What was the trial outcome? Prosecutor Marcia Clark, who would later gain fame for the O.J. Simpson trial, led the case against Bardo. The defense argued mental illness should mitigate his responsibility, presenting testimony about his psychological conditions. However, the prosecution demonstrated premeditation through his cross-country travel and preparation. Bardo was convicted of first-degree ending in 1991 and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The jury rejected the mental illness defense, finding that his actions showed planning and intent despite his psychological struggles. In a 2019 prison interview, Bardo expressed remorse, stating, "She should be here. I feel tremendous guilt about taking Schaeffer's life." Whether this represented genuine insight or an attempt at rehabilitation remains debated. What changed because of this case? Schaeffer's ending led directly to California's first anti-stalking law in 1990, followed by similar legislation nationwide. The Driver's Privacy Protection Act of 1994 restricted access to DMV records, closing the loophole Bardo had exploited to find his target. As of 2026, Robert John Bardo remains incarcerated at Ironwood State Prison in Blythe, California, where he is serving his life sentence. The case continues to be cited in discussions about celebrity safety and the dangers of obsessive fan behavior. Schaeffer was just 21 when her life ended, on the verge of landing her first major film role. Her family has maintained privacy over the decades, though the impact of her loss rippled through the entertainment industry and changed how public figures protect their personal information. Another case would mirror this tragedy in the digital age. Kevin James Loibl. On June 10, 2016, singer Christina Grimmie was meeting fans after a concert in Orlando when a man approached during the meet and greet. Kevin James Loibl, a 27-year-old from St. Petersburg, Florida, had traveled to the venue with a specific deadly purpose. Loibl had developed what investigators called an unrealistic infatuation with the Voice contestant after following her online career and performances. His obsession had grown over approximately a year before the attack, intensifying to dangerous levels that those around him noticed but failed to report. What was his background? Loibel came from what neighbors described as a troubled home environment, where he lived with his parents and maintained minimal social connections. His only close friend later revealed that Loibel had been fixated on Grimmy, returning borrowed magazines with cryptic messages like, "I love you, brother," and "I'm tired and ready to ascend." These statements suggested planning and a mindset that viewed death as a transformation rather than an ending. Mental health professionals who reviewed the case posthumously noted indicators of delusional thinking and possible depression that went untreated. How did the attack unfold? Loibel legally purchased 2 handguns and ammunition in the days before the concert, raising no red flags despite his lack of prior gun ownership or training. He traveled from St. Petersburg to Orlando specifically for Grimmy's show at the Plaza Live. During the meet and greet, he approached with his arms open as if for a hug, then pulled out a handgun and shot Grimmy 3 times at point-blank range. Her brother Marcus immediately tackled Loibel, preventing him from harming other fans waiting in line. Loibel broke free from Marcus's grasp and turned the gun on himself, ending his own life at the scene. Grimmy was rushed to a nearby hospital, but was pronounced deceased shortly after arrival. She was only 22 years old and had been planning to release new music. Why did he do this? Police investigation revealed no prior direct contact between Loibel and Grimmy, suggesting the relationship existed entirely in his mind. Investigators found evidence of extensive online research about Grimmy, including her performance schedule and appearance locations. Digital forensics showed he had been following her social media and public appearances for months, building a one-sided connection that escalated to violence. The motive remained officially unclear, though experts suggested he may have felt rejected despite never actually approaching her before the attack. What was the aftermath? Because Loibel ended his own life, no trial occurred, and many questions about his specific motivations remained unanswered. The investigation closed after confirming he acted alone with no accomplices or broader conspiracy. Grimmy's family filed a lawsuit against the venue, noting that while security performed bag checks, they failed to use metal detectors or pat-downs, allowing Loibel to enter with 2 concealed handguns and a hunting knife. The case raised questions about safety protocols at smaller venues where artists interact directly with fans. The tragedy highlighted the vulnerability of performers at intimate events and the dangers of parasocial relationships in the digital age. Her ending prompted discussions about security at meet and greets and the need for threat assessment training for venue staff. Sometimes the danger comes not from a stranger, but from someone who was once trusted. Bekir E. In December 18, 2018, at a school in Rotterdam, 16-year-old student Humera Öz was shot in the bicycle sheds of the Design College in Rotterdam. Bekir E., a 31-year-old man, had been stalking his ex-girlfriend despite a restraining order that should have kept him away from her. The victim had reported Bekir's behavior multiple times to authorities, describing threatening messages and unwanted contact that made her fear for her safety. She had an appointment scheduled with police on the day she was ended, planning to provide additional evidence of his violations. What led to this tragedy? Bekir had been in a relationship with the victim that ended, but he refused to accept the separation. His behavior escalated from persistent contact attempts to direct threats, prompting the restraining order. However, he continued to violate the order with no meaningful consequences until the fatal confrontation. An inspectorate investigation later revealed that authorities had failed to treat her case as stalking, instead handling it as separate incidents of harassment. This fragmented approach meant the pattern of escalating behavior wasn't recognized as the serious threat it represented. How did the attack occur? Bekir waited for her at the school bicycle sheds, a location he knew she would pass. He confronted her and fired multiple shots, ending her life in what prosecutors described as a calculated attack driven by his inability to accept rejection. Bekir fled the scene but was arrested shortly after, as police responded to reports of the incident. The weapon was recovered, and forensic evidence clearly linked him to the scene. His flight demonstrated consciousness of guilt, despite his later claims in court. What happened at trial? During proceedings, Bekir claimed, "I didn't mean to end her life," an assertion prosecutors rejected given the premeditated nature of bringing a weapon to her school and waiting for her arrival. The court heard testimony about his pattern of threatening behavior and violations of the protective order. In December 2019, he was convicted and sentenced to 14 years in prison, plus mandatory psychiatric treatment. The sentence reflected Dutch law's approach to cases involving mental health factors, requiring treatment alongside incarceration. The court determined he needed psychiatric care due to personality disorders that contributed to his inability to accept relationship endings. This treatment component means he could potentially remain in psychiatric detention beyond the 14-year prison term if deemed a continued danger. What systemic failures were exposed? The case revealed serious gaps in how Dutch authorities handled stalking reports. The victim's file showed multiple complaints that weren't properly connected or escalated, meaning the full picture of Bekir's dangerous behavior never reached decision-makers who could have intervened more forcefully. An official inspectorate report criticized police for not treating the case as stalking, which would have triggered different protocols and more serious responses. The fragmented handling allowed Bekir to continue his harassment despite the restraining order. The tragedy prompted calls for reform in how stalking cases are processed, including better training for officers to recognize escalation patterns and improved information sharing between different police units. However, reports from 2024 suggest implementation of these reforms has been slow. The victim's family became advocates for change, pushing for legislation that would make stalking intervention more effective and prevent similar tragedies. Her case remains a focal point in Dutch discussions about domestic safety and the need for proactive rather than reactive approaches to threatening behavior. While this case exposed institutional failures, the next would reveal how even clear warnings can go unheeded. Tremont Harry Dillon. In October 2016, 24-year-old Alice Ruggles was found deceased in her Gateshead flat, with her throat cut in what a judge would later call an act of utter barbarism. Her ex-boyfriend, 26-year-old soldier Tremont Harry Dillon, had refused to accept their breakup. Dillon, a lance corporal in the British Army, had been stationed at Edinburgh Barracks when he and Ruggles began dating. The relationship lasted several months before she ended it, citing his controlling behavior and jealousy that made her increasingly uncomfortable. How did he harass her after the breakup? Dillon began a campaign of contact, despite her clear requests to leave her alone, sending hundreds of messages and calling repeatedly. He contacted her friends and family members, trying to manipulate them into convincing her to reconcile with him. Ruggles reported his behavior to police, who issued him with a police information notice, a formal warning about harassment. When he continued, she obtained a restraining order prohibiting any contact. However, these legal measures did nothing to deter him from his obsessive pursuit. On the night she was ended, Dillon drove 120 miles from his barracks to her home, violating both the restraining order and military regulations by leaving base without permission. He broke into her flat through a window, waiting for her to finish showering. What happened during the confrontation? Dillon attacked Ruggles in her own home, cutting her throat in a way that suggested rage and intent. The medical examiner's report described the wound as extending ear to ear, indicating extreme force and violence. She fought for her life but stood no chance against the trained soldier. He fled the scene immediately, returning to his barracks where he was arrested within hours, as police connected him to the crime through witness statements and forensic evidence. His attempt to establish an alibi by returning to base quickly fell apart under investigation. What was the trial outcome? At trial in 2017, Dillon claimed self-defense, arguing that Ruggles had attacked him first and he had only defended himself. This claim was thoroughly rejected by forensic evidence showing the nature and location of her injuries, which were inconsistent with any defensive action on his part. The jury convicted him following deliberations, and the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years before parole eligibility. The judge's remarks emphasized the premeditated nature of his actions, from the long drive to the break-in to the manner of attack. How did her family respond? Ruggles's family established the Alice Ruggles Trust to raise awareness about stalking and harassment, particularly focusing on how warning signs are often dismissed or minimized. They advocate for better training for police and others who encounter stalking reports, emphasizing that harassment can escalate rapidly to violence. Her parents have spoken publicly about the need for stalking to be taken seriously from the first report, not after multiple incidents have already occurred. They point to the restraining order Dillon violated as evidence that paper protections mean nothing without enforcement. Alice had been a University of Sunderland graduate working in Newcastle, building a career and life independent of Dillon. Her family and friends described her as vibrant and ambitious, making her loss all the more devastating. As of 2026, Dillon remains imprisoned, with his earliest possible release date not until 2038, assuming parole is granted. The military discharged him following his conviction, ending the career he had used to project an image of discipline and control. The case demonstrated how stalking often escalates despite official intervention, particularly when the perpetrator feels entitled to their target's attention. Another stalker would similarly disregard repeated warnings with fatal results. Michael Lane. On August 25, 2016, 19-year-old Shauna Grice was found deceased in her bedroom in Portslade, England. Her throat had been cut, and her bedroom set on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. Michael Lane, her 27-year-old ex-boyfriend, had been stalking her for months despite her repeated reports to police. Grice had ended her brief relationship with Lane after recognizing warning signs of controlling behavior. However, Lane refused to accept the breakup and began a campaign of harassment that would prove fatal. What did he do after she ended the relationship? Lane placed a tracking device on Grice's car to monitor her movements, allowing him to know where she went and when. He slashed her tires and broke into her home while she was away, violating her sense of safety in increasingly brazen ways. Grice reported Lane to Sussex Police 5 separate times in 6 months, documenting his harassment with specific examples and expressing genuine fear for her safety. She told officers about the tracking device, the break-ins, and his unwanted contact attempts that violated her boundaries. How did police respond? In an egregious mishandling of the case, police fined Grice £90 for wasting police time after they deemed one of her reports exaggerated. This fine had a chilling effect, making her hesitant to continue reporting Lane's escalating behavior despite the danger she faced. Officers failed to connect the pattern of her multiple reports, treating each incident in isolation rather than recognizing the cumulative picture of stalking behavior. This fragmented approach meant Lane faced no meaningful consequences for his actions until it was too late. What happened on the day she was ended? Lane broke into Grice's home in the early morning hours and entered her bedroom as she slept. He cut her throat and then attempted to cover up the scene by setting fire to her bedroom, hoping investigators would conclude she had taken her own life. Forensic investigators determined the fire had been deliberately set, and autopsy results showed the throat wound was not self-inflicted. Police quickly identified Lane as the prime suspect based on Grice's previous reports and evidence from the crime scene. What was revealed during investigation? Detectives discovered that Lane had stalked 13 other women before targeting Grice, establishing a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years. Many of these women had also reported him to police with varying degrees of response, suggesting the system had failed multiple potential victims. The tracking device on Grice's car provided digital evidence that placed Lane at her residence repeatedly when he should not have been there. This technological evidence proved crucial in establishing his pattern of surveillance. What was Lane's sentence? In March 2017, Lane was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The judge emphasized the premeditation shown by his bringing a weapon and attempting to stage the scene afterward. Lane showed no remorse during proceedings, maintaining he was innocent despite overwhelming evidence. His lack of accountability reflected the entitlement and disregard for others' autonomy that characterized his stalking behavior. What reforms followed? An independent Police Complaints Commission investigation found multiple failures in how Sussex police handled Grice's reports. One officer was found guilty of misconduct for the wasting time fine that discouraged her from seeking help. National guidance was issued prohibiting the use of such fines in stalking cases, recognizing that victims should never be penalized for reporting harassment. Police forces nationwide received training on recognizing stalking patterns and taking victim reports seriously from the first complaint. Grice's family has continued advocating for systemic change, ensuring her case serves as a catalyst for improved responses to stalking reports. Another case would demonstrate similar escalation from online harassment to fatal confrontation. Joshua Stimpson. On June 29, 2017, 23-year-old Molly McLaren was sitting in her car at a gym parking lot in Chatham, Kent. Joshua Stimpson, her 26-year-old ex-boyfriend, approached and stabbed her 75 times in a sustained attack that witnesses described as shocking in its brutality. Stimpson and McLaren had met on the dating app Tinder and dated for approximately 7 months before she ended the relationship. She broke up with him after recognizing concerning patterns in his behavior that made her feel unsafe. What happened after the breakup? Stimpson launched an online harassment campaign, posting negative content about McLaren on social media platforms. He created posts calling her abusive and manipulative, attempting to damage her reputation among friends and family. McLaren reported Stimpson to police for harassment, and he was arrested for assault during a previous confrontation. However, he was released on bail just days before ending her life, highlighting gaps in risk assessment procedures. Stimpson also began following McLaren in person, showing up at locations where she would be. On the day of the attack, he tracked her to the Pure Gym parking lot, where she was sitting in her vehicle after finishing a workout. How did the attack unfold? Multiple witnesses observed Stimpson approach McLaren's car, some initially thinking it might be a relationship dispute. However, the situation quickly escalated as he began the sustained attack through her car window and door. The 75 stab wounds reflected extreme rage and intent, going far beyond what would be necessary to cause death. Forensic pathologists noted that many wounds were inflicted after she had already sustained fatal injuries, suggesting the attack continued even after she could no longer defend herself. Emergency services arrived quickly due to witness calls, but McLaren was pronounced deceased at the scene. Stimpson remained nearby and was immediately arrested, making no attempt to flee despite the public nature of his actions. What defense did he present at trial? During his 2018 trial, Stimpson pleaded not guilty based on diminished responsibility, claiming mental illness had impaired his judgment at the time of the attack. His legal team presented evidence of personality disorders and depression. The prosecution argued that his behavior showed clear premeditation, including following McLaren to the gym and bringing a weapon. The jury rejected the diminished responsibility defense, finding him guilty of ending life. The judge sentenced Stimpson to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years before parole eligibility. The lengthy minimum term reflected both the brutality of the attack and the stalking behavior that preceded it. What impact did this case have? McLaren's family established a foundation to raise awareness about stalking and the dangers of not taking harassment seriously. They advocated for better training for those who interact with stalking victims, from police to friends and family. The case prompted discussions about bail conditions in cases involving harassment charges. Stimpson's release just days before the attack raised questions about whether risk assessments adequately considered the danger to victims. Social media companies also faced scrutiny for how they handle harassment complaints on their platforms. The ease with which Stimpson could post attacking content about McLaren highlighted gaps in content moderation policies. McLaren had been a University of Kent student, studying business and entrepreneurship, building toward a promising future that was cut short. Her family described her as kind and ambitious, making the senseless nature of her ending all the more painful. As of 2026, Stimpson remains imprisoned, with no possibility of release before 2043, assuming parole is granted at that time. The case continues to be referenced in stalking awareness campaigns across the UK. Sometimes the danger comes not just from ex-partners, but from brief acquaintances who won't accept rejection. Michael Petch. On September 4, 2005, 22-year-old Claire Bernal was working at her job as a beauty consultant at Harvey Nichols in London when Michael Petch, a 30-year-old security guard, entered the store and shot her in front of customers and colleagues. Petch had met Bernal through work at a different location, and they had gone on 3 dates before she decided she wasn't interested in pursuing a relationship. However, Petch became obsessed with her and refused to accept her rejection. How did he harass her? Petch began sending Bernal up to 50 text messages per day, overwhelming her phone with unwanted communication. The messages ranged from professions of love to threats about what would happen if she didn't respond or didn't agree to see him again. He made direct threats to end her life if she didn't reciprocate his feelings, escalating from persistent contact to clear expressions of intent. Bernal reported these threats to police, who arrested Petch for harassment. Critically, Petch was released on bail while awaiting trial for the harassment charges. This bail decision would prove fatal, as it gave him the opportunity to carry out his threats despite clear evidence of danger to Bernal. What happened at Harvey Nichols? On that September morning, Petch entered the upscale department store during business hours, carrying a concealed weapon. He approached Bernal at her cosmetics counter and shot her, causing chaos and terror among shoppers and staff. Petch then turned the gun on himself, ending his own life at the scene. The attack occurred in broad daylight in one of London's most prestigious shopping areas, shocking the public and raising immediate questions about how someone out on bail for threatening could access a firearm. What were the legal findings? Because Petch ended his own life, there was no criminal trial. Instead, a coroner's inquest examined the circumstances of both deaths. The coroner ruled Bernal's ending as unlawful homicide while recording Petch's death as taking his own life. The inquest revealed multiple systemic failures that allowed the tragedy to occur. Most critically, the decision to grant Petch bail, despite his clear threats, showed inadequate risk assessment procedures at the time. Questions also arose about how Petch obtained a firearm in the UK, where gun ownership is heavily regulated. Investigation revealed he had illegally acquired the weapon, but the ease with which he did so while facing charges highlighted gaps in security protocols. How did her family respond? Bernal's mother became a vocal advocate for stalking law reform, campaigning for changes in how authorities handle harassment cases and bail decisions. She emphasized that Claire had done everything right by reporting the threats. Yet the system failed to protect her. The family pushed for what they called Claire's Law, though the specific legislation that eventually passed under this name addressed domestic relationship disclosure rather than stalking bail conditions. However, their advocacy contributed to broader changes in how stalking cases are handled. What changed because of this case? The tragedy prompted review of bail conditions in harassment cases, particularly when the accused has made explicit threats. Courts became more cautious about releasing defendants when there's clear evidence of danger to specific individuals. Workplace safety protocols also received attention, as Bernal's employer had known about the threats but had limited options to protect her beyond general security measures. The case raised questions about employer responsibilities when employees faced targeted threats. Claire had been building her career in the beauty industry while studying at university, with plans for the future that would never be realized. Her ending highlighted the deadly gap between recognizing danger and having systems in place to prevent it. The case demonstrated that even reporting threats and obtaining charges against a harasser doesn't guarantee safety without proper bail decisions and risk assessment. While this happened in a public space, the next case would show how stalkers can penetrate even the supposed safety of a victim's home. Louis Sacco. On November 16, 2020, 23-year-old Celeste Mano was ending in her bed at her family's Melbourne home. Louis Sacco, a 35-year-old former co-worker, had broken into the house and stabbed her 23 times in a shocking attack that ended her life. Sacco had worked with Mano at a call center, where they had what he perceived as a friendly relationship. However, when he expressed romantic interest and Mano made clear she was not interested, he could not accept the rejection and began stalking her. How did the harassment develop? After Mano rejected his advances, Sacco began creating fake social media accounts to contact her, circumventing her blocks and continuing unwanted communication. The fake profiles allowed him to monitor her activities and maintain contact, despite her efforts to cut him off completely. Mano reported Sacco's behavior to both their employer and police, documenting the escalating nature of his contact attempts. She wrote him a letter begging him to stop his harassment and leave her alone, but this only seemed to intensify his obsession. At one point during his stalking campaign, Sacco sent messages suggesting thoughts of self-harm, using these statements as manipulation tactics to maintain her attention and sympathy. His communications showed a pattern of attempting emotional control when direct approaches failed. What happened the night of the attack? Sacco broke into the Mano family home through a window while the family slept, navigating through the house to reach Celeste's bedroom. He attacked her in her bed, stabbing her repeatedly in what prosecutors described as a sustained and deliberate assault. Celeste's mother woke to the sounds of the attack and tried to intervene, but Sacco fled before she could reach her daughter's room. The family called emergency services immediately, but Celeste had already sustained fatal injuries. Police arrested Sacco shortly after the attack as he attempted to leave the area. Forensic evidence, including DNA and the weapon, linked him conclusively to the scene, making his guilt undeniable from an evidentiary standpoint. What happened at trial? The trial was delayed multiple times as Sacco attempted various legal maneuvers. He initially tried to claim he was experiencing psychosis at the time of the attack, but psychiatric evaluations found this claim was fabricated. Forensic psychiatrists testified that Sacco had attempted to fake mental illness symptoms to establish an insanity defense. His performance during evaluations was inconsistent with genuine psychotic episodes, and his detailed planning of the attack contradicted claims of impaired judgment. In April 2024, Louis Sacco was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 30 years for the murder of Celeste Mano. The judge emphasized the premeditated nature of breaking into her home and the vulnerability of attacking someone while they slept. How did the family respond? Celeste's mother spoke powerfully during victim impact statements, describing the trauma of hearing her daughter's attack and being unable to prevent it. The family has advocated for better responses to stalking reports and improved risk assessment procedures. The case highlighted how workplace-based stalking can escalate even after employment ends, with Sako continuing his harassment long after they were no longer colleagues. Organizations faced questions about their responsibilities when employees report being harassed by current or former coworkers. Celeste had been working in call centers while planning her future career, living at home with her supportive family. Her ending in what should have been the safety of her own bedroom particularly devastated those who loved her. As of 2026, Sako is serving his sentence in an Australian prison, with no possibility of parole until he has served the minimum term. His attempts to manipulate the legal system through fake mental illness claims added an additional layer of betrayal to an already tragic case. The tragedy demonstrated that even clear documentation and reporting of stalking behavior may not prevent escalation when perpetrators are determined. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Across the world, similar patterns of obsession would play out with equally devastating results. Patrick Kennedy. On April 20th, 2003, 38-year-old Peggy Klinke was shot and ended in her Turlock, California apartment by her ex-boyfriend Patrick Kennedy, who then took his own life at the scene. The murder-suicide culminated a cross-state stalking campaign that had terrorized Klinke for months as she tried desperately to escape his control. Kennedy had a documented history of controlling behavior in previous relationships, with ex-wives later reporting that he had used threats and manipulation to maintain power over them. This pattern of behavior should have raised red flags when he began pursuing Klinke, but the information wasn't effectively shared between jurisdictions or available to those who might have intervened. How did the stalking begin? Klinke had dated Kennedy briefly before recognizing his controlling tendencies and ending the relationship. However, Kennedy refused to accept the breakup and began following her as she attempted to escape his harassment by moving to different locations, each time hoping distance would finally free her from his obsession. Kennedy followed Klinke across multiple states as she tried to rebuild her life away from him. Each time she relocated, he would track her down and resume his harassment, making it impossible for her to feel safe anywhere. This cross-state pursuit demonstrated the level of obsession and resources he devoted to maintaining control over her movements. He engaged in property vandalism at her residences, damaging her belongings and leaving evidence of his presence to ensure she knew he had found her again. These acts of vandalism served both to intimidate and to demonstrate that no distance could keep her safe from him. Kennedy frequently threatened to take his own life if Klinke didn't return to him, using these threats as emotional manipulation. Mental health professionals recognize this tactic as a common control mechanism in situations involving harassment, designed to make the victim feel responsible for the perpetrator's well-being and decision-making. What happened on the day of the attack? Kennedy traveled to Klinke's Turlock apartment, where he confronted her in what would become the final encounter. He shot her multiple times in what investigators determined was a planned attack, bringing a weapon specifically for this purpose rather than acting impulsively. After ending Klinke's life, Kennedy used the same weapon on himself, completing the murder-suicide in a pattern unfortunately common among stalkers who view their targets as possessions. Forensic investigators confirmed the timeline and sequence of events through ballistic evidence and crime scene analysis. Because Kennedy ended his own life, no criminal trial occurred, leaving many questions about his specific motivations and planning unanswered. However, the pattern of behavior leading up to the tragedy painted a clear picture of escalating obsession and control that had consumed him entirely. How did Klinke's family respond? Klinke's sister, Debbie Riddle, became a passionate advocate for stalking victims, speaking publicly about the failures that allowed Kennedy to continue his harassment across state lines. She emphasized that the fragmented nature of law enforcement jurisdictions had prevented a coordinated response to his threatening behavior. Riddle worked tirelessly to push for legislative changes that would improve information sharing between states and strengthen penalties for stalking. Her advocacy helped ensure that Peggy's ending would lead to systemic improvements, rather than being just another tragic statistic in the growing list of stalking-related fatalities. What was Peggy's Law? The case inspired California legislation known as Peggy's Law, signed in 2005, which increased penalties for stalking offenses and improved mechanisms for tracking stalkers who cross jurisdictional boundaries. The law recognized that modern stalkers often don't respect geographic limits and that legal responses needed to adapt. The legislation made it easier for prosecutors to charge stalkers with felonies rather than misdemeanors when the behavior showed a pattern of escalation. It also enhanced penalties for stalkers who violated restraining orders or who stalked victims across state or county lines, creating more serious consequences. Riddle's advocacy extended beyond just legislative changes. She spoke at community events, law enforcement trainings, and universities about recognizing stalking behavior and taking threats seriously before they escalate to violence. Her personal story gave powerful weight to the message that stalking is not just annoying behavior, but can be a precursor to fatal confrontation. What lessons emerged from this case? The case highlighted the deadly danger of threats involving self-harm, which victims and authorities often struggle to assess properly. Kennedy's repeated threats to end his own life were classic manipulation tactics, but they also indicated someone whose thinking had become dangerously distorted and who might be capable of harming others as well. The cross-state stalking demonstrated gaps in how jurisdictions communicate about dangerous individuals. Kennedy's pattern of following Clinky meant that by the time authorities in one location became aware of the situation, he had already moved to another jurisdiction, and the information didn't follow quickly enough to prevent continued harassment. Kennedy's father later told media that his son had snapped, but this characterization minimized the months of deliberate stalking behavior that preceded the attack. Mental health professionals note that this type of violence typically involves planning rather than sudden breaks from reality, making the snapped narrative dangerous. Universities began incorporating Clinky's story into their safety programs, with Riddle speaking to college students about recognizing warning signs and not dismissing controlling behavior as romantic attention. Young adults, who may be navigating their first serious relationships, particularly needed education about the difference between normal relationship conflicts and dangerous patterns. Klinka had been working to rebuild her life in California, pursuing employment opportunities and trying to establish independence after escaping Kennedy's control. Her family described her as vibrant and determined, qualities that made her refusal to return to an unhealthy relationship understandable, but which ultimately couldn't protect her from Kennedy's violence. The tragedy illustrated a pattern seen in many murder-suicides involving ex-partners, perpetrators who view their targets as possessions rather than autonomous individuals, leading them to choose ending both lives rather than accepting the loss of control. This mindset represents an extreme form of entitlement that views rejection as unacceptable and worthy of the ultimate punishment. The reforms that followed Peggy's ending have helped other victims obtain protection and hold their stalkers accountable before escalation to violence, though gaps in the system remain. Not every stalker operates alone or in person. Melvin Rowland. On October 22, 2018, 21-year-old Lauren McCluskey was shot and ended outside her dorm at the University of Utah by her ex-boyfriend Melvin Rowland, who then took his own life in a nearby church. The tragedy occurred despite McCluskey reporting Rowland to campus police 20 times in the weeks before her ending, making it one of the most preventable campus deaths in recent history. Rowland, a 37-year-old registered offender, had lied about his identity and criminal history when he began dating the college student. Rowland lied about his age, name claiming to be Sean Fields, and hid his status as a sex offender on parole who had served nearly a decade in prison. How did she discover his lies? McCluskey learned the truth about Rowland's background through online searches that revealed his real name and extensive criminal record. She immediately ended the relationship upon discovering his extensive deception. Recognizing the danger of being involved with someone who had hidden such serious information and violated parole. After the breakup, Rowland began an extortion campaign, using intimate photos to demand money from McCluskey. He threatened to share the images publicly if she didn't comply, extracting $1,000 from her through these threats. This financial manipulation was part of his broader pattern of control and intimidation designed to maintain power over her. McCluskey and her parents made over 20 contacts with the University of Utah Police Department in the 10 days leading up to her death. What were the police failures? Campus police treated her reports as low priority, failing to recognize the escalating danger or run proper background checks that would have immediately revealed Rowland's status as a parole violator. Officers delayed investigating her complaints for days and weeks, losing crucial time to intervene before the situation became fatal. The police department didn't verify Rowland's identity properly, which would have shown he was on parole and prohibited from the behavior McCluskey described. His parole status meant any verification would have resulted in immediate arrest and detention, potentially saving her life through the simplest of investigative steps. McCluskey's mother contacted campus police directly expressing concern for her daughter's safety and pleading for action, but her calls went unreturned. This failure to engage with family members who were trying to advocate for the victim represented another missed opportunity for intervention that could have prevented the tragedy. What happened on the night she was ended? Rowland lured McCluskey outside her dorm by using someone else's phone, pretending to be returning a car she had lent him. When she came out to the parking area to meet what she thought was a friend helping with the vehicle, Rowland was waiting with a gun, having planned the ambush carefully. Rowland ambushed and abducted McCluskey as she walked back to her dorm, dragging her into the back of a car, where he shot her around 9 p.m. Students and staff heard the shots and called emergency services immediately, but she died at the scene despite rapid response. The brazen nature of the attack on a busy campus shocked the university community. Rowland fled to a nearby church, Trinity AME, where he took his own life as police closed in on his location. Because he ended his own life, no trial occurred to examine his motivations or hold him accountable through the justice system. What was the aftermath? The University of Utah conducted an independent review that found multiple failures in how campus police handled McCluskey's reports. The review revealed that her case had been mishandled at multiple levels, with officers failing to follow basic investigative procedures that are standard practice in law enforcement. In October 2020, the university settled a lawsuit with McCluskey's parents for $13.5 million and agreed to implement significant campus safety reforms. The settlement represented one of the largest in university history and acknowledged the institutional failures that contributed to her death through negligence. The university established the Lauren McCluskey Foundation to improve campus safety and support victims of relationship harassment. The foundation funds research, training, and programs aimed at preventing similar tragedies on college campuses nationwide and ensuring her death leads to lasting change. McCluskey had been a track and field athlete at Utah, balancing her studies and athletic commitments while building toward graduation. Her family described her as driven, compassionate, and dedicated, making her preventable loss all the more devastating to those who knew her potential. Changes implemented after her ending included 911 dispatchers for campus police, better training on harassment cases, and improved communication protocols. These reforms aimed to ensure future reports would receive immediate and appropriate attention rather than being dismissed or delayed. An ESPN documentary examined the case in 2023, bringing renewed attention to the systemic failures and the importance of taking victim reports seriously. The documentary highlighted how multiple opportunities to protect McCluskey were missed due to bureaucratic failures and lack of urgency from those tasked with her safety. The case became a rallying point for improved campus safety protocols nationwide, with universities examining their own procedures for handling harassment reports from students and making changes to prevent similar tragedies. Another case would demonstrate how stalking can escalate through careful planning. Paul Tyson. On October 25, 2023, 21-year-old Lily James was found deceased in a bathroom at St. Andrew's Cathedral School in Sydney, where she worked as a water polo coach. Her ex-boyfriend, 24-year-old Paul Tyson, used a hammer-like object to murder Lily James in a utility room at St. Andrew's Cathedral School in a premeditated attack finalized after hours of tracking her. Tyson and James had dated for approximately 5 weeks before she ended the relationship. However, Tyson could not accept the breakup and began following her in the days after the separation, demonstrating the rapid escalation from relationship ending to fatal stalking. What did the investigation reveal? CCTV footage showed Tyson conducting dry runs of his attack plan, visiting the school multiple times in the days before to rehearse his movements and timing. These recordings captured him walking through the building, timing routes, and planning the confrontation with disturbing precision. A coronial inquest found that Tyson's behavior showed escalating patterns of coercive control during their brief relationship. Even in just 5 weeks together, witnesses reported observing concerning patterns in how he interacted with James and responded to boundaries she tried to establish. The inquest heard that Tyson displayed characteristics of violent masculinity, feeling entitled to James's attention and viewing her rejection as unacceptable. His response to the breakup reflected an inability to process the loss of control over another person. How did the attack occur? On the night of October 25th, Tyson entered the school and confronted James in a bathroom where she was working late. He attacked her with a hammer, causing fatal injuries in what the coroner described as a brutal and sustained assault. After ending James's life, Tyson called emergency services himself to report what had happened. However, before police could arrive and take him into custody, he fled the scene and headed to the coast. Within hours of the attack, Tyson's body was recovered at Diamond Bay near Vaucluse, several kilometers from the Gap, after he died by suicide shortly after the murder. His body was recovered from the rocks below, and the coroner ruled his death as taking his own life in the context of having just committed homicide. What did the coronial inquest find? The 2025 inquest examined the circumstances leading to both deaths, hearing testimony from friends, family, and experts about the warning signs and patterns. The coroner concluded that Tyson's actions were calculated and premeditated, not impulsive, based on the CCTV evidence of planning. The coroner noted that Lily's decision to end the relationship led to an escalation in coercive behaviors from Tyson, demonstrating how rejection can trigger dangerous responses from controlling individuals. The inquest emphasized that the brief nature of their relationship didn't diminish the severity of the control dynamics. Experts testified about gendered patterns in such cases, where men who view women as possessions rather than autonomous individuals respond to breakups with extreme measures. The inquest placed the ending in this broader context of gender-based harm. How did James's family respond? James's family has advocated for stronger coercive control laws in New South Wales, pushing for legislation that would criminalize patterns of controlling behavior before they escalate to physical harm. They emphasized that coercive control should be recognized as a serious offense in its own right. The family called for better education about relationship warning signs, particularly for young people who may not recognize controlling behavior as dangerous. They stressed that even brief relationships can involve serious control dynamics that shouldn't be dismissed due to the short timeline. A coroner's recommendation suggested young people reconsider moving quickly into intimate relationships, allowing more time to assess partners' behavior patterns. This recommendation proved controversial, with some arguing it placed responsibility on victims rather than perpetrators. What impact did this case have? The case received significant media attention in Australia, sparking national conversations about the speed at which controlling relationships can become deadly. James's death occurred less than a week after the breakup, demonstrating the compressed timeline from separation to fatal violence. Tyson's parents were reportedly shut out of proceedings, with the focus remaining on James as the victim and the systemic issues that failed to prevent her ending. The family dynamics on Tyson's side received limited public attention compared to the advocacy work of James's family. Schools examined their security protocols after James was ended in a workplace where she should have been safe. The case raised questions about after-hours access to school buildings and procedures for staff working alone late at night. James had been passionate about water polo coaching and was building a career working with young athletes. Her family described her as energetic and dedicated, making her loss particularly painful for the school community and the students she mentored. The careful planning shown in the CCTV rehearsals demonstrated that Tyson's actions, while triggered by rejection, involved deliberation rather than impulsive rage. While this stalker's planning was captured on camera, another would track his victim across international borders. Albert Morgan. On December 26, 2024, 25-year-old flight attendant Anastasia Nikulina was found deceased in her Dubai hotel room, stabbed multiple times in what authorities believe was an attack by her ex-boyfriend. Alexei Kondratiev, a 41-year-old Russian man, allegedly followed Nikulina to the United Arab Emirates and ended her life in the hotel where she was staying. Nikulina had moved from Russia to Dubai to work as a flight attendant, specifically to escape Morgan's harassment after their relationship ended. The decision to relocate internationally highlighted the severity of his stalking and her desperate attempts to create distance between them. What made this case particularly chilling? Before her ending, Nikulina recorded a video stating, "That's it, we're done, leave me alone," in what friends interpreted as a message to Morgan. The recording, which circulated after her death, showed her explicitly telling him to stop contacting her and accepting their separation. In the video, Nikulina appeared to predict her own fate, suggesting she knew Morgan might harm her despite the international distance she had created. Her awareness of the danger made the failure to protect her even more tragic. How did Morgan find her in Dubai? Morgan allegedly tracked Nikulina's location through social media and flight schedules, using publicly available information to determine when she would be in Dubai. Her work as a flight attendant meant her general location was sometimes predictable based on airline routes and schedules. He traveled to the UAE and located the hotel where she was staying, demonstrating the lengths he was willing to go to maintain access to someone who had clearly ended their relationship. The international nature of his pursuit showed obsession that transcended normal boundaries. What happened at the hotel? Morgan allegedly tricked a hotel maid to gain entry to Nikulina's room, using deception to bypass security measures meant to protect guests. Once inside, he allegedly stabbed Nikulina 15 times, inflicting fatal injuries in what prosecutors would characterize as a sustained and deliberate attack. Hotel staff discovered Nikulina's body in a pool of blood after she failed to check out at the scheduled time. The scene indicated a violent confrontation and contradicted any claims that this was anything other than a planned attack. After the ending, Morgan fled Dubai and returned to Russia, attempting to escape prosecution in the UAE. However, international cooperation between law enforcement agencies led to his identification as the primary suspect. Russian authorities arrested Morgan on suspicion of homicide after UAE officials requested his detention. The arrest came as investigators gathered evidence from the Dubai crime scene, including forensic materials that allegedly linked Morgan to the attack. As of January 2026, Alexei Kondratiev remains in custody in Russia, where he is facing trial for the murder under Russian laws concerning crimes committed against citizens abroad, as Russia does not extradite its own nationals. UAE authorities have issued requests for his extradition to face ending charges in Dubai, where the offense occurred. However, Russia's extradition policies and the diplomatic relationship between the countries will determine whether he is transferred to UAE custody. What does this case reveal about international stalking? The case highlighted how stalkers can exploit international travel and digital tracking to pursue victims across borders. Nikulina's attempt to create safety through geographic distance proved insufficient against someone determined to maintain contact. Her video message demonstrated that she was aware of the danger, yet existing systems couldn't prevent Morgan from reaching her in another country. The limitations of restraining orders and other protective measures become even more apparent when perpetrators and victims are in different legal jurisdictions. Friends and family mourned Nikulina through social media, sharing memories of her life and career aspirations that were cut short. The international nature of her work meant she had connections across multiple countries, all affected by her loss. The case raised questions about how airline industry workers, who are inherently mobile and whose locations are somewhat public, can protect themselves from stalkers who exploit that visibility. Not all stalkers pursue victims directly. Some delegate the violence to others. Kazuhito Komatsu. On October 26, 1999, 21-year-old Shiori Ino was stabbed at Okagawa Station in Japan by a hired attacker. Kazuhito Komatsu, a 26-year-old brothel operator who had been stalking Ino after their breakup, had orchestrated the attack through intermediaries after she refused to return to him. Komatsu had dated Ino briefly before she ended the relationship. Recognizing problematic aspects of his character and lifestyle, his involvement in operating a brothel and connections to organized crime should have raised concerns. But Ino's attempts to separate from him peacefully were met with escalating harassment. How did the stalking develop? After the breakup, Komatsu began following Ino and monitoring her activities, refusing to accept that their relationship was over. He sent threatening messages and appeared at locations where she would be, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance that made her feel unsafe. Ino reported Komatsu's behavior to police multiple times, providing specific examples of his harassment and expressing fear for her safety. However, police responses were inadequate, treating her complaints as minor disputes rather than recognizing the pattern of escalating stalking behavior. At the time, in 1999, Japan had no specific anti-stalking laws, leaving police with limited tools to intervene even when victims reported persistent harassment. This legal gap meant Komatsu faced no serious consequences for his behavior until it escalated to orchestrating violence. What happened at the train station? On the evening of October 26th, a man approached Ino at Okagawa Station as she waited on the platform. The attacker, hired by Komatsu through intermediaries, stabbed Ino multiple times before fleeing the scene. Ino died from her injuries at the station, despite the presence of other commuters and relatively quick emergency response. The public nature of the attack shocked the community and raised questions about safety in spaces typically considered secure. How were the perpetrators caught? Investigation revealed the network of individuals involved in planning the attack, with evidence connecting Komatsu to the hired attacker through multiple intermediaries. Komatsu's brother Takeshi and several others were arrested for their roles in facilitating the ending. Before he could be taken into custody, Kazuhito Komatsu ended his own life in 2000, preventing a trial where he would have faced direct charges for orchestrating Ino's ending. His taking his own life meant many details about his motivations, and the full extent of his planning remained unexplored. Takeshi Komatsu and others involved in the conspiracy were prosecuted, with the hired attacker receiving the most serious sentence. The attacker was sentenced to life imprisonment for carrying out the actual ending, a sentence upheld on appeal in 2005. The case demonstrated how stalkers with resources and connections can escalate from personal harassment to hiring others to commit violence, making intervention even more complex. The network of accomplices showed premeditation and planning rather than impulsive action. What legal changes resulted? Uno's ending became a catalyst for Japan's first anti-stalking law, passed in 2000, less than a year after her death. The legislation gave police tools to intervene in stalking cases and established specific penalties for harassment behaviors that previously had no legal consequences. The law defined stalking behaviors and created mechanisms for victims to obtain protection orders, filling the gap that had left Ino vulnerable despite her reports to authorities. The speed with which the law passed reflected public outrage over the preventable nature of her ending. However, debate continued about whether the law went far enough, with advocates pointing to continued stalking-related violence in Japan as evidence that implementation and enforcement needed improvement. The law represented a significant step forward, but not a complete solution. What was the controversy over police response? Ino's family filed a lawsuit against police for negligence in handling her stalking reports. In 2005, the High Court refused to acknowledge that police negligence had led to the fatal outcome, a decision that frustrated advocates seeking accountability for systemic failures. The court's ruling suggested that even with better police response, Komatsu might have found other ways to harm Ino, effectively absolving authorities of responsibility for not taking her reports seriously. This legal precedent concerned those working to improve victim protection, as it seemed to excuse inadequate responses. Ino had been a young woman at the start of her adult life, working and building independence when Komatsu's obsession destroyed her future. Her case remains influential in Japanese discussions about stalking and the importance of early intervention when harassment is reported. The tragedy demonstrated that even creating new laws isn't sufficient without proper training and willingness to use those tools to protect victims. While Komatsu hired others to commit violence, another stalker would personally carry out a workplace rampage. Richard Wade Farley. On February 16, 1988, Richard Wade Farley entered ESL Incorporated in Sunnyvale, California, armed with multiple weapons in what would become one of the deadliest workplace shootings in California history. He ended the lives of 7 people and wounded 4 others, including his primary target, Laura Black, in a workplace rampage motivated by his obsessive stalking of the electrical engineer. Farley, a 39-year-old former Navy serviceman, had worked at ESL as a computer technician when he became fixated on Black, a co-worker in the defense contractor's engineering department. He began stalking her in 1984, sending her over 200 letters despite her clear rejections of his romantic overtures that began almost immediately after they started working together. How did the harassment develop over 4 years? Black repeatedly told Farley she was not interested in a relationship, making her boundaries clear from the beginning. However, he refused to accept her rejections and escalated his pursuit with increasing intensity. His letters became increasingly obsessive and lengthy, some running to dozens of pages detailing his feelings and demanding her attention despite her explicit requests to leave her alone. The letters showed Farley's deteriorating mental state, with content becoming more demanding and threatening over time. He expressed beliefs that Black secretly wanted to be with him, but was confused or influenced by others, demonstrating classic delusional thinking patterns seen in dangerous stalkers. Farley engaged in surveillance of Black's home, driving past her residence repeatedly and monitoring her activities outside of work hours. He learned her routines and schedule, using this information to maintain his fixation and demonstrate that he could track her movements at any time. In 1986, ESL fired Farley due to his harassment of Black, but this termination only intensified his obsession rather than ending it. The loss of daily workplace proximity to Black seemed to fuel his rage rather than prompt him to move on with his life, as he continued sending letters and monitoring her. What prompted the final escalation? Black obtained a restraining order against Farley in early 1988 after his continued harassment post-firing became unbearable. The restraining order seemed to trigger his decision to carry out a violent attack, viewing this legal protection as a final rejection that demanded an extreme response. On the morning of February 16th, Farley arrived at ESL heavily armed with multiple rifles, shotguns, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, indicating extensive planning. He forced his way into the building and began shooting, targeting anyone he encountered as he searched for Black through the facility. The rampage lasted for hours as Farley moved through the building, seeking Black while shooting other employees who crossed his path or tried to stop him. The random nature of many deaths highlighted how his obsession with one person led to mass casualties among innocent colleagues. Farley shot Black in the shoulder, wounding but not ending her life. She survived by pretending to be more seriously injured than she was, remaining still while Farley moved through the building, ending the lives of others who crossed his path. Her quick thinking likely saved her life. The rampage ended when police surrounded the building and established a perimeter. After a standoff lasting several hours, during which Farley made calls to negotiators, he surrendered without taking his own life, eventually facing trial for his actions. What happened during the trial? Farley was tried for 7 counts of first-degree ending and 4 counts of attempted ending. The prosecution presented the 200-plus letters he had sent to Black as evidence of premeditation and obsession, showing the years-long buildup to the workplace shooting and his increasingly threatening mindset. Farley showed no remorse during proceedings, instead blaming Black for his actions by obtaining the restraining order that he viewed as unjustified. His lack of accountability and continued fixation on Black even during trial demonstrated the depth of his delusional thinking about their relationship. During the standoff with police, Farley had cried and expressed emotional distress, but this appeared to be self-pity rather than genuine remorse for the lives he had taken. His focus remained on his own feelings of rejection rather than the devastation he had caused. Farley was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1991. He currently remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison. The California Supreme Court upheld his sentence in 2009, rejecting multiple appeals and affirming that the death penalty was appropriate given the calculated nature of his crimes and the mass casualties. What legal impact did this case have? The Farley case became one of the catalysts for California's anti-stalking law passed in 1990, demonstrating the deadly potential of persistent workplace harassment that goes unchecked. The law gave employers and law enforcement more tools to intervene before stalking escalated to violence, creating specific criminal penalties. The case is cited in workplace violence prevention training programs nationwide as an example of how obsessive fixation on a coworker can escalate to mass casualties. Organizations learn to take employee harassment reports seriously and intervene early rather than simply removing the harasser from the workplace and hoping the problem would end. Black's experience became a case study in how restraining orders can sometimes escalate danger rather than reducing it, when perpetrators view legal intervention as a final rejection. This doesn't mean restraining orders shouldn't be used, but highlights the need for enhanced protective measures when they're issued against dangerous individuals. What is Farley's current status? Farley has spent over 37 years in custody as of 2026, though California's moratorium on the death penalty remains in effect. California's de facto moratorium on executions since 2019 means he continues in prison despite his sentence, aging in custody with no execution date set. Appeals continue with various legal challenges, though courts have consistently upheld his conviction and sentence through multiple review cycles. His case represents one of the clearer examples of premeditated workplace violence motivated by stalking obsession, making successful appeals unlikely. Who were the innocent victims? The 7 people Farley ended had no connection to his fixation on Black. They were simply colleagues who were present when he decided to act on his rage over rejection. Survivors have recounted the horror of the rampage, describing the terror of hiding and hearing gunshots throughout the building for hours. Their families have maintained that the tragedy was entirely preventable if Farley's escalating behavior had been taken seriously earlier. The company's decision to simply fire him without other interventions proved insufficient to protect Black and other employees from his violent intentions. Black survived her injuries and has maintained privacy over the decades, understandably choosing not to remain in the public eye. Her experience of being stalked for years and then surviving a mass shooting that ended the lives of colleagues highlights the complex trauma victims face. The case demonstrated how one person's obsession can ripple outward to destroy multiple lives and families, with casualties extending far beyond the primary target of the stalker's fixation. While Farley's obsession was with a co-worker, another case would involve fixation on a romantic rival. Qingxuan Pan. On February 6, 2021, 26-year-old Yale graduate student Kevin Jiang was shot and ended in New Haven, Connecticut, just days after announcing his engagement. Qingxuan Pan, a 29-year-old MIT researcher, had been secretly obsessed with Jiang's fiancée and ended Jiang's life in what prosecutors described as an act of jealous rage. Pan had known Jiang's fiancée from a previous acquaintance, developing feelings for her that were not reciprocated. When she became engaged to Jiang, Pan's fixation intensified into an obsession that would lead to careful planning of violence. How did Pan target Jiang? Pan researched Jiang's schedule and movements, tracking when and where he would be vulnerable. On the night of February 6th, Pan ambushed Jiang in his vehicle on Lawrence Street in New Haven, shooting him multiple times at close range. Jiang was found by passers-by shortly after the shooting, still in his vehicle with fatal gunshot wounds. He was rushed to Yale New Haven Hospital, but pronounced deceased from his injuries. The seemingly random nature of the attack initially puzzled investigators. Evidence at the scene included shell casings and forensic materials that would eventually link Pan to the crime. Gunshot residue analysis and DNA recovered from the scene provided crucial physical evidence connecting him to the shooting. Why did Pan target Jiang specifically? Investigators determined that Pan's motive was jealousy over Jiang's relationship with the woman Pan desired. Despite having minimal actual contact with her, Pan had constructed an imagined relationship in his mind where they were meant to be together. Pan viewed Jiang as an obstacle to this fantasy relationship, leading him to plan the ending as a way to remove the perceived barrier. The delusional nature of his thinking meant Jiang died because of a relationship that existed only in Pan's imagination. How was Pan apprehended? Pan fled Connecticut immediately after the shooting, beginning a manhunt that would span 3 months. He traveled across multiple states attempting to evade capture, using various methods to hide his location and identity. Authorities traced Pan's movements through financial transactions and surveillance footage, gradually narrowing his possible locations. In May 2021, U.S. Marshals arrested Pan in Montgomery, Alabama, ending the manhunt. At the time of his arrest, Pan was found in possession of items suggesting he had been monitoring Jiang's fiancée, indicating his obsession continued even after ending Jiang's life. This evidence supported prosecutors' theory about his motive. Pan initially pleaded not guilty and prepared for trial, but eventually changed his plea. In February 2024, Pan pleaded guilty to 1 count of ending, accepting responsibility for Jiang's death in exchange for a negotiated sentence. During sentencing, Pan apologized to Jiang's family and the court, expressing remorse for his actions. However, his apology could not undo the devastation he had caused or bring back the promising young man whose life he had ended. Pan was sentenced to 35 years in prison, meaning he will be in his 60s before potential release. The sentence reflected both the premeditated nature of the crime and the loss of Jiang's life and future contributions. How did this impact the victims' families? Jiang's fiancée and family provided victim impact statements describing how Pan's obsession had destroyed their lives. Jiang had been days away from his wedding, making the timing particularly cruel as his family processed losing him at what should have been a joyous time. The fiancé reported feeling unsafe even after Pan's arrest, knowing that Pan's obsession with her had motivated the ending. She described the psychological burden of being the object of fixation that led to someone's death, even though she bore no responsibility. Jiang had been an Army National Guard veteran and Yale graduate student studying for his graduate degree when his life was ended. His military service and academic achievements made his loss particularly painful for those who knew his dedication and potential. What does this case reveal about obsessive jealousy? Pan's actions demonstrated how delusional fixations can lead to violence against innocent third parties, not just the objects of obsession. Jiang had no relationship with Pan and was unaware of being targeted until the moment of attack. The case highlighted risks faced by people in relationships with those being stalked, as partners can become targets of violence from obsessed individuals. This expanded understanding of who is at risk in stalking situations beyond just the primary target. As of 2026, Pan is imprisoned and will remain so until at least 2056, assuming he serves his full sentence. His prosecution provided some measure of justice for Jiang's family, though it could never restore what was taken. The final case would show how years of stalking could culminate in a deadly ambush. Kanwarpal Singh. On December 19, 2022, 21-year-old law student Farzana Yakubi was ambushed and stabbed multiple times near her Auckland, New Zealand home. Kanwarpal Singh, a 30-year-old man who had been stalking Yakubi for approximately 2 years, had carried out the attack after she repeatedly rejected his advances. Singh had become fixated on Yakubi despite having no legitimate relationship with her, pursuing her with increasing aggression as she made clear she was not interested. His behavior included following her, making unwanted contact, and sending threatening messages. What was the pattern of harassment? Singh's stalking included threats of kidnapping and acid attacks if Yakubi didn't agree to be in a relationship with him. These extreme threats demonstrated the dangerous mindset of someone who viewed her as something to be possessed rather than a person with autonomy. He sent messages stating 365 days to love me, setting arbitrary deadlines for when she must reciprocate feelings that didn't exist. This revealed his delusional belief that persistence alone would eventually force her compliance. Yakubi reported Singh's behavior to police multiple times, providing specific examples of his threats and expressing fear for her safety. An independent police conduct authority review later found police response to her complaints was inadequate, failing to recognize the escalating danger Singh posed. On the morning of January 8th, Singh waited near Yakubi's home for her to leave. When she emerged, he ambushed her with a knife, attacking in broad daylight in her residential neighborhood. Singh stabbed Yakubi 12 times in the sustained attack, inflicting fatal injuries. The number and placement of wounds indicated intent to end her life rather than simply harm or threaten her. Neighbors heard the attack and called emergency services, but Yakubi died at the scene before help could arrive. The brazen nature of the daylight attack in a residential area shocked the community. Singh fled, but was arrested shortly after, as police responded to the scene. Witness descriptions and forensic evidence quickly identified him as the perpetrator. What happened at trial? During proceedings, Singh's defense argued he came from a troubled background, attempting to provide context for his behavior. He reportedly blamed his parents for his actions, refusing to take personal responsibility for his choices to stalk and ultimately end Yakubi's life. The prosecution presented the years of stalking and explicit threats as evidence of premeditation, showing Singh had planned violence against Yakubi for an extended period. His messages and behavior demonstrated escalating danger that should have triggered intervention. In May 2023, Singh was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years, a sentence that stands as of 2026 following his failed appeal. The sentence reflected the premeditated nature of the attack and the years of harassment that preceded it. What happened on appeal? Singh appealed his sentence, arguing it was too harsh given factors his defense team raised. In 2025, the appeal was denied, with the court finding the original sentence appropriate for the severity of the crime. The appeals court noted the sustained nature of Singh's stalking campaign and his refusal to accept Yaqubi's rejections as aggravating factors. His behavior over 2 years showed a pattern of escalation that made the fatal ending foreseeable. The Independent Police Conduct Authority found that police handling of Yaqubi's stalking complaints was inadequate, failing to properly assess the risk Singh posed. Officers didn't take sufficient action to protect her despite her multiple reports and specific threats. The review identified missed opportunities for intervention that might have prevented the tragedy. Better training on assessing stalking risk and more aggressive enforcement of protection orders could have saved Yaqubi's life. The case prompted calls for reform in how New Zealand police handle stalking reports, particularly involving threats as explicit as those Singh made. The failures mirrored problems seen in other jurisdictions, where stalking victims are not taken seriously until after violence occurs. How did Yaqubi's family respond? Yaqubi's family expressed devastation at losing their daughter, who had been pursuing her law degree and building toward a promising career. She had been balancing her studies at Auckland University of Technology with her concerns about Singh's harassment. The family advocated for better protection for stalking victims, emphasizing that Yaqubi had done everything right by reporting Singh repeatedly, yet the system failed to protect her. Their advocacy focused on ensuring her death would lead to meaningful reforms. Yaqubi had been working toward becoming a lawyer, studying diligently and maintaining hope for her future despite Singh's harassment casting a shadow over her daily life. Her ambitions and potential made her loss particularly painful for the community. As of 2026, Singh remains imprisoned with his earliest possible release date not until 2039. His failed appeal means the sentence stands, though no punishment can restore what was taken from Yaqubi and her family. The case demonstrated yet again how stalking victims face danger even when they report threatening behavior, particularly when police responses are insufficient to match the level of risk. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.